So let's get into, or back into, the second rebellion, which we started last week, and we just want to tie together a few loose ends from last week, a few topics that we didn't get to before we jump into the flood narrative next week. So let's review. In the second rebellion, what happened was some, not all, some of the sons of God leave their positions in the heavenly hierarchy to take physical form and to sleep with women. And this is an intentional rebellion against God, his design for how the celestial and terrestrial worlds were to be united. In Eden, they were allowed to come together, but they weren't supposed to be doing this. They certainly weren't supposed to be leaving their places in the divine council. So this is an intentional rebellion, and you're supposed to read it that way. This was not authorized by God. God wanted his terrestrial and celestial families united. God only has one family. I shouldn't even pluralize that. But in the way that they were in Eden. Now that humanity is east of Eden, the celestial beings, some of them anyways, are leaving their proper places and uniting to humanity in a way that is not authorized, which is to say, sexually. The sons of God, this phrase, they are celestial beings, they are not humans. The Hebrew phrase, B'nai Elohim, only refers to God's council members, probably his highest ranking council members, those who actually sit on thrones and help decide. They're higher in rank than the angels, but they're lower in rank than God. So they give these familial language, sons of God. Beings of God's counsel who are the closest to God are the ones who are abandoning their place given to them by the grace of God to go down to lower beings and shack up with them. They are not the sons of Seth. The daughters of men are not the daughters of Cain's line. So I got flustered and I said this completely wrong last week because I think I said it one way and then I thought I was wrong, and then the slide that I had, I typed it in wrong. The idea of the Sethite interpretation of this passage is that the sons of God are humans, the sons of Seth out of Genesis 5, while the daughters of men are supposed to be the daughters who are born into Cain's line at the end of Genesis 4. There is no reason to read this language here. Once you realize that B'nai Elohim, sons of God in Hebrew, only ever refers to a single group of beings, celestial beings, in the Old Testament, you cannot come to this conclusion. The topic has changed from the genealogies of Adam and Eve through Seth and Cain to something else. Something new is being introduced in the story. They're just not humans, which means they are not humans who claim divine status. If people don't go with the Sethite interpretation, people will often go with, well, ancient kings were said to be the sons of God. Well, the problem with that was that they never pluralized the term. There was one son of God at a time and one king at a time and stuff. Like there's all sorts of reasons why that is closer to an ancient idea, but ultimately doesn't pan out. The argument that angels can't have sex that you will often hear today comes from a misreading of Jesus' words in Matthew 22, specifically verse 30, when he's talking to the Sadducees. At the resurrection, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage, but they will be like the angels, which, as we looked at last week, had nothing to do with the capacity for sex. It just meant that celestial beings, like the angels, don't have to reproduce in order for their species to continue. That's a human trait. And in the resurrection, we will be immortal. We will be undieable, unkillable, and we will not need to use sex to reproduce to preserve humanity. To the ancient Near Eastern mind, any celestial being could take on any physical form they wanted, and they could do whatever was possible in that physical form without ever being bound in that physical form. And this will be true as before we ever get out of the book of Genesis. Like, if you don't accept it here, are you going to accept it in like Genesis 18, 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah, where three celestial beings and one of them is God show up? They have a meal with Abraham. and then two of them go down to test Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot, they're like grabbing Lot, and they're doing all sorts of things, physically interacting with the physical world, because that's what you did when you came down in physical form. And you will find when celestial beings, and most of them, of the angelic category, come down to interact with humans in the world, they could do it in any way, shape, or form. This was not something they were supposed to be doing. They're rebelling against God to do this, and humanity is joining them in their rebellion. This idea is distinct from the incarnation of Jesus via the supernatural conception of Jesus by the Holy Spirit overshadowing Mary. Some people think that, well, you can't have celestial beings having sex with humans because it affects the incarnation. It affects the doctrine of the incarnation for celestial beings to take on physical form and father the Nephilim and stuff. No, the incarnation is something completely different. The Nephilim are not celestial beings. The sons of God are celestial beings. They are not being conceived in physical form. They are not being born. The incarnation of Jesus Christ is something incredibly different, and it's designed to address this exact thing right here. If you actually read Second Temple literature on the sons of God coming down, they come down to a place called Mount Hermon. You know where Jesus goes in the Transfiguration? To the region of Hermon, up to a high mountain. Maybe it's actually Mount Hermon, but the point could not be more clear if you're a Second Temple Jew. He's come to address this rebellion as much as anything. There's a whole wide world of stuff that you don't hear in church preaching because they don't know it. That Jesus' incarnation addresses exactly this type of thing. The rebellion of celestial beings to take on human flesh and birthing the Nephilim. All sorts of this concepts are addressed in the incarnation and life of Jesus and in his death, burial, and resurrection and enthronement, as we've been talking about on Wednesday nights. But it is something different than just what God does in the Old Testament. God himself takes on human form a lot to appear in visions to people. It happens all the time. We've already looked at it at some of this, but the incarnation is not that. It's something way, way greater. Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism that wrote Genesis 1 through 11, only had one interpretation for the events in Genesis 1 through 8. Celestials rebelled and abandoned their proper places in God's created order to set up their own little kingdoms. They knew what they were doing and they chose to do it. Therefore, Yahweh, Lord of the council, who created these beings and gave them their positions, destroyed the world and restarted with Noah. All of this is related to the celestial assumptions and the sons of God that we studied before we came into these portions of Genesis. This was exactly why. If you don't remember who the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, are, you need to go back and watch those videos on YouTube. So that when we get here, all you have to do is plug in who the sons of God are and what they're doing in this passage. And then these were some of the verses that I mentioned. First, Enoch 6 through 11. This is where the sons of God come down to Mount Hermon. Jubilees 4 and 5 tell you these are celestial beings. The Dead Sea Scrolls also refer to this instance as the Genesis Apocryphon, where Noah's father looks at his son, and I guess he was just too big of a baby, and said, I think this is one of the Nephilim. And then he goes and he looks for Noah's grandfather, Methuselah. Lamech, his grandfather. No, Lamech is Noah's father. Yeah, and he went to Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, and said, I think my wife slept with one of the sons of God and that my son is an illegitimate Nephilim. They only had one interpretation. And although those are extra biblical sources, 2 Peter 2 and Jude both reference this as rebellions for divine and human beings and how they both get punished. Because they're both trying to argue for, in their day and age, rebellious teachers who are just saying, hey, why don't you just indulge in whatever your feelings are? Like today. Like people get on TikTok, and I've seen this all week long. I don't know if it's been by accident or by God's providence, but I've seen all these TikToks this week. And I'm not even on TikTok. These are people that are watching TikToks on YouTube that are commentating on these TikToks who are saying, "Oh, God gave free will, therefore He cares more about what you having freedom than what you actually do with your freedom." It's like, that is such crap. You're just looking at the parts of the Bible you want so that you can justify doing what you want. And it says that's exactly the attitude of the people that Peter and Jude are addressing when they're writing those specific letters, and saying they're just like the people in Noah's day. And just like those people were condemned to die in the flood, and even the celestials were cast into darkness and Tartarus, just like that, these people that are trying to twist things now to their own ends will receive their justified goals if they don't repent. Okay, so who are the Nephilim? Remember that the Nephilim are human offspring of the sons of God having children with the daughters of men in the second rebellion. It is a broad, encompassing term. It can refer to lots of different groups who would come up later. When Israel is going into the land to conquer, they are supposed to wipe out the Anakim and the Raphaim, or a third group called the Amorites, which are all specific. The Anakim and the Raphaim are specific giant clans. But all three terms refer to and descendants of the Nephilim. Nephilim comes from the Aramaic word that means giant. This is what I argued for last week. It's why the Septuagint translates the word as giant. The people living back then understood what they were saying. The argument that you typically hear today is that Nephilim comes from the Hebrew word naphal, that means to fall, and they're the fallen ones. And it's a way of getting out of their uncomfortable idea that celestial and terrestrial beings are shacking up together. They don't want it to be celestial beings having sex with women. So they say, well, Nephilim comes from a word that just means fall, so these are just a way of describing fallen humans. No. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament about 200 years before the events of the New Testament began. They translated the word Nephilim as giant. Why would they do that? Because they were much closer in space and time to understanding. This is not a Hebraic word. This is an Aramaic word that they transliterated into Hebrew. And we got the word Nephilim. So the word means giant. The descendants of the Nephilim are the Anakim and the Raphaim in Numbers 13. The only other place that Nephilim is used is other than Genesis 6:4 is Numbers 13:33. It's the only two places it comes up. But the Anakim and the Raphaim come up a little more commonly in the Old Testament. They are descendants of the Nephilim, giant clans that existed during the conquest age. The term Amorites that you will see is designed to be a more encompassing term, not a particular tribe, but they're not calling them Nephilim for whatever reason. And I will say this, because I don't think I mentioned this last week. They were supposed to go in and they were supposed to wipe out this people in the conquest. Everybody else they got to drive out. They were supposed to wipe out the Nephilim descendants. They didn't want to do it, so they died off in the wilderness for 40 years. The next generation comes in, and they were supposed to take it up. And although they do fight, they don't actually finish the job. And so the Nephilim's descendants of the Anakim and the Raphaim are allowed to keep going until the time of David and his mighty men. You read those stories and you don't skip them. David and his mighty men very clearly wipe out the Nephilim descendants. They finish the job that was supposed to be done at the beginning of the conquest. So let's talk about what a giant was to the ancient mind. The average height in biblical times was around 5 foot. Now, I think last week I typed it in wrong on my slides, so I probably said it wrong. I think I said last week the average height was around 5'4", 5'3" to 5'5". I typed those in wrong on my slides because I typed them in wrong here because I was looking at the wrong part of my notes. The average height was about 5 foot, right? You subsist on bread and water for the most part, and then you've got fruit. They didn't have access to the quantity of food that we had, or that we have today. So the average height was much shorter. So a giant was not a mythological sized person of 20 plus feet. It just wasn't. It wasn't a 9-foot tall person with bones that they discovered. Every scholar of the Old Testament who knows about the Nephilim knows about those bones that are like 9 foot tall, that look like human bones but are not. They're animal bones. And they know those aren't part of the Nephilim story. Because a giant was a man of around 6.5 to 6'8". That's all. There is a supernatural component to their birth, but it is not the supernatural mythological component that you often hear from Hollywood and sensationalized stories and interpretations. You have to acknowledge the supernatural. You do not want to acknowledge the sensational. The stuff that's just out there to be shocking and wild. That is bad interpretation. And all of the scholars know about these human remains that aren't human remains, but they don't use it in their peer-reviewed scholarship, and they will not get printed for that because every one of them knows those aren't human remains. So do not let somebody say, well, they've discovered these bones that are this big and stuff, and so the Nephilim were 12 or 15 or 20 feet tall. No, they weren't. An example, the only sized Nephilim that we actually get, or descendant of Nephilim that we get, is Goliath. His size is quoted in 1 Samuel 17:4. But it depends on which Hebrew text you actually pay attention to. The Masoretic text puts him at 9 foot 9 inches. There's a problem with that. The Masoretic text is a medieval document. It's pretty good, but here and there it's going to have some mistakes. 1,000 years after the events of the New Testament, they're including all of these extra vowel points to their language because the language had changed and moved on since then. So you have to compare the Masoretic text that puts Goliath at 9 foot 9 with the actual Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. Both Second Temple documents that put Goliath at 6 foot 6. The Masoretic text came way, way later, and it is every scholar of the Old Testament knows if the Masoretic text disagrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint agree, you take the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, because they were actually written during that time period. The Masoretic text 1,000 years later could have made all sorts of mistakes. A 6 could have been turned into a 9 easily enough. You know, when they added the vowel points, they could have accidentally made any number of mistakes. Now, again, for the most part, the Masoretic text is great. But this type of stuff does happen in translation and scribal errors over time. Now, you compare the Masoretic text to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're almost exactly right in every way, shape, and form. They only typically change spelling, but this is one of the things that got changed. Medieval Judaism was much more sensational. Second Temple Judaism was supernatural without necessarily having to be sensational. So a giant could be defined as somebody who's 6 foot 6, and Goliath's size should be taken as being about 6 foot 6, out of 1 Samuel 17:4. The unusual size of these people groups was attributed to divine origin, something a belief in the supernatural must allow. It is not, however, an excuse for reading of the text that is cartoonish or bizarre, meaning they didn't grow to be 20 plus, they didn't even grow to be 12 foot, these Nephilim. How tall were the biblical giants? The only measurements for the giants that existed in the biblical text is that of Goliath. The traditional Masoretic Hebrew text has him at 6 cubits and a span in 1 Samuel 17:4, which is roughly 9 foot 9 inches. The Dead Sea Scrolls reading in 1 Samuel 17:4 disagrees and has Goliath at 4 cubits and a span, or 6 foot 6 inches. Virtually all scholars consider the Dead Sea Scrolls reading superior and authentic. Then down on the footnote, he notes, the smaller size is also the reading of the Septuagint. So you need not see it as a cartoonish, bizarre, sensationalized version of this. Okay, that's all review and a little bit extra from last week. So let's read the text that we read last week, Genesis 6, 1 through 8. Let's read this, and then we'll jump into a last few things that we just didn't get to last week. to close out this week. When humans began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the B'nai Elohim saw the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness in the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." And did God get angry? No. Verse 6, the Lord regretted that he had made humans being on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So, what we're going to talk about today is the first part of this statement that we read last week, but we didn't get to talking about polemic. So, Genesis 6, 1 through 8 is an example of ancient Near Eastern polemic. I'll tell you what that means in just a second. Polemic used to make a singular point. The sons of God abandoning their place in God's council to sleep with women was an anti-God act which corrupted the world to such an extent that God would hit the reset button and return the world to the state of pure primordial chaos from before the 7 days of creation. And then, as implied in the creation story, we'll start over with Noah. Okay, so to understand that, here's the question. What is polemic? It's not a big word. It's not a scary word. In the unseen realm, Dr. Heiser says that polemic is a literary and theological effort to undermine the credibility of the Mesopotamian gods and other aspects of that culture's worldview. When Dr. Heiser is trying to plug Genesis 6 and the second rebellion and the birth of the Nephilim into the biblical stories, he's trying to point out that the ancient Hebrews are doing something literary in this passage. Polemic is something that they use to say, your gods are wrong, your gods are wrong, your gods are wrong. I don't care who you are. You Ugaritic people who worship Baal, your gods are wrong, and that's a big problem in the Old Testament. The Egyptian gods are wrong, and so Exodus is written in such a way that God, Yahweh, goes up against the Egyptian gods and shows them that the Egyptians are wrong to worship these gods. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is trying to point out that worshiping and exalting the beings that came as a result of the sons of God rebellion is wrong. That's all. It's a much more simplistic idea, but because we don't understand it as a polemic, we sensationalize anything and everything that we can. The Bible is an ancient Near Eastern Hebraic document. Whether you realize it or not, it was written a long time ago in light of the world the authors were living in with ideas which they needed to confront. They are confronting the pagan propaganda of their day. And they are trying to say, you are wrong, we are right. Because your gods are wrong, the civilization that you built because of these gods coming down is wrong. They didn't help the world, they corrupted the world. And we know this because our God, the highest God, Yahweh, showed that he was still sovereign and destroyed the world that you built. That's it. That's all the story is trying to do. Because when you actually know the pagan propaganda of the day, you realize that they're trying to confront that pagan propaganda. Their Hebrews want to undermine, challenge, and just flat out contradict ancient world ideas. So, in the ancient pagan propaganda of Babylon, there was the belief that their civilization was built by a group called the Apkalus. The Apkalus were the Babylonian version of the sons of God to the Hebrews. What the sons of God were in Hebrew terms, the Apkalu were in Babylonian terms. They were celestial beings, aka they were gods, considered great sages, possessed great knowledge in the pre-flood world. They come down. They are celestial beings who come down to humanity and they pass on great learning of things like technology, warfare, alchemy, magic, makeup and beauty practices. And it didn't help the world, it corrupted the world. It turned sex into a sensual game. It corrupted women to the point where they say, hey, if you want to have some control here, here's what you do. Put a little makeup on and attract the man that you want to lure into whatever trap and use him for whatever purpose you want to use him for. But sex is a great way to entrap men. And the Babylonian idea is that they learned this from the gods, from the Apkallu, from the sons of God who come down in this rebellion. These are pre-flood, antediluvian, if you know that term, which we talked about like 2 weeks ago. Pre-flood creatures, gods who come down. And yeah, they shack up with women and they birth the Babylonian kings who were giants. They were Nephilim. They were bigger and stronger than you. Everything that they did was for building up the Babylonian civilization and eventually the Babylonian Empire. When the civilization got so big that they could go to war because they accepted these warfare technologies and passed them along even after the flood. The biblical authors know this, and they are using this idea to address to them, hey, this wasn't actually good for the world, but that's what Babylon preaches. The world is better off because we know these things. Well, you can't unknow them, but the Bible is saying, actually, this was not good. How do you know? God was grieved, and then God destroyed it. When in the Babylonian literature, when the Apkallus create the Nephilim, and the Nephilim's an Aramaic/Hebraic word used here. So when they birth these Babylonian giant kings and stuff, some of them were considered 2/3 Apkallu. The most recognizable one of that would be Gilgamesh. This is my copy of the Gilgamesh epic. It is a Babylonian story, and it has a flood narrative in it. It's very short. You can see it's not very long, and this has an introduction and stuff with translation notes in it, so the text itself is even shorter. But you should take some time to read it and actually read, oh, he's a giant. He's 2/3 Apkallu, and he's considered a giant. I've got a picture of him on a slide coming up, and you can kind of get a sense of the scale that they used in their literature of him. But that was, of course, sensationalized. And they're trying to make the point that might makes right. And because our heroes are bigger, everything that they did was right. And that's just not true. And so you want to be familiar with this type of literature to basically understand what your Old Testament is doing. Because it does this everywhere. Polemical connections, they're everywhere in the Old Testament. They're everywhere in the New Testament if you know how to read ancient Near Eastern religions. The biggest example, probably the most predominant one, is from Ugarit, which is Israel's neighbors directly to the north. And they particularly affect Baal worship in Israel's northern kingdom during the divided kingdom. And then eventually they work their way down to Judah. Baal worship. In Baal worship, Baal is called the cloud rider. But you will find all throughout the Old Testament, the description is deliberately and intentionally given to Yahweh. In Daniel 7, it's given to the Son of Man to make claims about who is ruling in heaven and therefore on earth. Look at Deuteronomy 33:26, Psalm 68:4, 104:3, Daniel 7:13 with the Son of Man, and then all these places where Jesus is said to be riding on the clouds. By the time of the New Testament, being the cloud rider was a very common idiom for saying the ruler. They get it from religions predominantly like Ugarit and Baal worship. That's an example of polemic. Baal is not the real cloud rider. He's not the real ruler. Yahweh is the cloud rider. Yahweh is the real ruler. The sons of God coming down and birthing the Nephilim was not a good thing, and the society that was built by it was not good, it was bad. That's the point of the polemic that is Genesis 6, 1 through 8, specifically 1 through 4. These polemical connections are everywhere throughout the Bible with ancient Near Eastern religions. In the prologue of Genesis, which is 1 through 11, chapters 1 through 11 alone, there are dozens, as many as 30, like depending on how you count, dozens of polemical ideas that connect with texts like the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story. I quoted from it when we were talking about creation stories. Marduk takes on Tiamat and then builds his temple. The Eridu Genesis, the Tales of Adapa, the Sumerian Kings list, I brought that up when we were talking about Genesis 5 and the long lives of the sons of Seth. Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I've already mentioned. En-Makar and the Lord of Aratta. A lot of these places, if you're familiar with them, Gilgamesh, for one, is called 2/3 Apkallu in the text. This is a picture of him. The way that they represent him in stone is to say, that's a lion he's holding. See how small the lion is next to him? Because they pictured him as big enough to take on a lion with his bare hands. It's not because they thought he was literally that big necessarily, but when you're trying to actually use visual symbols in the ancient world, you don't have paintings. You have stone. You have one chance to make a visual representation of it. This is what they did. They made him really big and the lion really small, because that's the idea. Taylor. Kind of like a dog? Yeah. Probably because the size perspective that they were going with. You know, the ancient, up until the Renaissance, people didn't actually make art for accuracy, for what looked right to the human eye. They made art for what's called iconography. They made art to actually explain their religious ideas. So this is what it's doing. Gilgamesh was a hero of old, a man of renown, a big 2/3 Nephilim giant. He beat lions. How do you remember that? You make a big stone pillar where he's that big and the lion's that small, and you can't forget that part of the story. It's not a literal representation even in their minds. They know that. So, if you knew this and you grew up on these stories in the ancient world, and then you came and you read Genesis 6, you would be reading this and you would say, wait. I was told my entire life that civilization was better because the Apkallu, or the sons of God, if you want to use that term, because these divine beings came down, shacked up with women, birthed giants, and then built culture and civilization. I was told when reading the Epic of Gilgamesh that the only reason the gods flooded the world, it wasn't really the world, but flooded the area and knocked out, was because they were annoyed with how much noise the humans were making. You read and you compare that, it's like, wait a second, Yahweh's not doing that. He's not annoyed with humanity. He's heartbroken about humanity. This tells us something about Yahweh and why he's God instead of the gods who came down. They're comparing ancient stories and they're arguing for Yahweh being God instead of these other beings. That these other beings are very, very bad. Any questions on that? Because that's all polemic is. And if you start paying attention to your Old Testament in particular, but it carries on in the New Testament, this stuff is everywhere. Rome made extremely similar claims to this. Rome preached the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The British Empire preached this type of stuff as well. America did this with Manifest Destiny. The same things have happened in history with many empires that was happening before the flood. The corruption of the people and the empires led them to actually do great and horrific things throughout the world, wherever their hand could reach. Because of that, their empires are come to an end. But God's empire will not come to an end. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is designed to be a direct attack on Babylonian religious propaganda. That they got divine help to build their culture and their society, and it was their responsibility to show that the world was better off if they conquered it and expanded their empire. You know, like they did with Judah and wiping them out and exiling them. According to Genesis 6, 1 through 8, the divine help that they got was illicit. It was invalid, and it was against the wishes of the one true God. Babylon was therefore considered to be anti-God. This is part of the reason why in the Old Testament, Babylon is the picture of being anti-God, and why in books like Revelation or 1 Peter, those who are in Babylon greet you. Babylon is the picture of the main enemy of God. Their knowledge and everything that they built, and they came from a source of celestials that God had not authorized and in no way blessed. So he completely broke down their society. The question is, if the flood was worldwide, how did the Nephilim live before and after the flood? Because in the text, in Genesis 4, it says Genesis 6:4, it says the Nephilim were on the earth in that day and also afterwards. There are three basic options for how this could have happened. Number one, the language of Genesis 6 through 9 does not need to be taken to describe a literal worldwide flood. For one thing, the ancients had no concept of a literal planet. For them, and we'll talk about this before we get into the flood, the world was a big flat disk. The underworld existed above it. There was a physical dome on top of it, and the heavens was sitting on top of that. And God would open the dome and let the rain fall down. That's their cosmology. They have no concept of a planet. And for them, that big flat land was pretty much the ancient Near East. Like Babylon, as far west as Tarshish. That was the world that they knew. So when it is describing a flood, it could be describing a regional flood in exaggerated language for polemical purpose. Many people, even the giants, could have survived such a flood. It is entirely possible, though I don't know how likely it is, that a flood in the past is being used in deliberate, hyperbolic, exaggerated language in Genesis 6 through 9 to refer to all the world being destroyed, but you will find that language of all the peoples and all the worlds and all this stuff. All throughout the Old Testament, you will find it being used, and then, like, take the conquest language. They drove out all the people. They killed all the people. And then it'll turn around in the next chapter and it'll say, and then the people stayed in the land. But it's not the Jewish people, it's the pagan people that they said that they destroyed and drove out. So all language need not mean literal all. You do not have to read the Bible overly literal. Literal, yes, depending on the literary nature of the text, but not overly literal. A regional flood in their minds of that day would have basically been the whole world, and they would have used language to describe that. That is the first possibility. The second possibility is this. Depending on the wording of Genesis 6:4, the sons of God slept with women both before and after the flood. The NIV translates it when they went to sleep with the daughters of men. You could take that word to mean whenever they slept with the daughters of men, meaning they could have slept with the daughters of men before and after the flood. So some people who feel the need to think they're defending the Bible by defending a planetary-wide flood have to take this option. And granted, this is perfectly possible. But if you're going to grant this option, you need to grant the option that by the language and laws of Hebrew, option 1 is just as likely. Option 3 is some combination of the first and second options. It could be a worldwide flood, and the sons of God could sleep with women after the flood. Both are perfectly possible. There's a lot that we don't know and we don't understand about the ancients and how they're writing their stories. So we have to, at this point, we have to accept more possibilities than exact answers. And this other possibility, without an exact answer, addresses, Grant, your question from like 3 weeks ago. What happens with the lifespans? Why are they shortened and stuff? Why did they live so long before the flood? Why do they start living shorter lives after the flood? Well, what does verse 3 mean? The Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." Is this statement about human lifespans? Some people will take it this way. Well, God put a limit on human lifespans. That's why people stopped living that way after the flood. So everybody's lifespans was much longer before the flood, and then after the flood they start to shrink, and then they get to a point that they're only 120 years. Like when? Because that seems a bit arbitrary. If this is the case, that it's about human lifespan, what of the 9 people in the Bible that I know of who live beyond 120 years? Genesis 11:10 through 27 speaks of 7 of them. They're all in the bloodline of Seth through Shem, the son of Noah, the son of Seth, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Shuri. Each of them lived beyond 120 years. Then you continue reading Genesis, and Abraham himself, who descends from these guys, lives 175 years, and Isaac, his son, lives 180 years. People will respond to that, well, it's a general number, it's a general rule. People will just generally stop living hundreds of years and they'll start living a couple hundred years. Well, okay, I will grant that is a possible interpretation. However, what does that have to do with the judgment that's actually going on here? What does that have to do with what God is actually responding to? See, I don't think that is the most likely. It may be a possible interpretation. It may be an answer to your question. I don't think it's the most likely interpretation. I think when God brings this up here, it is the number of years before God will judge the world via the flood. Because here he's trying to say, the world has become corrupt, therefore I will judge it. You have 120 years left to do what you're doing. Then I will wipe you out. Verse 3 tells us that God will judge the world. He will show, I am still the sovereign king of this world. I am above these celestial rebels. I am above the humans they rebelled with. And I'm above the giant Nephilim. So I will show that by wiping them all out. Verse 7 expands on this idea. It will not be merely humans. It will be everything underneath their God-given domain, and it will be judged. No, it's not actually until verse 17 that God, talking to Noah about building the ark, actually says he's going to flood the world. To say that verse 3 means God limits the lifespan of humans to 120 flies in the face of plenty of biblical evidence of people living that long anyways, so you have to take it as a general rule. But it has nothing to do with what's going on in the passage. Judgment. In a very general sense in verse 3, getting a little bit more specific in verse 7, and then finally down in verse 17, telling you how it's going to come. I think that makes more sense. When we say 120 years, the problem is that it could be a literary device for a lot of different things. Like, it could be just 3 generations. It could be a round number, is what I'm saying. 3 generations. It doesn't have to be an exact number. They did not have standardized time. They did not have the most exact standardized mathematics back in that day. They didn't have watches that could tell you exactly what time of day it was. You just kind of watched the sun and judged the time. That's it. And so they spoke in very general, broad categories. Maybe 120 years is doing the same thing. 40 years was a round number for 1 generation. 120 is 3 sets of 40. So perhaps God is saying, I will let you carry on this rebellion and this breeding for 3 generations. Then I will judge you and I will flood the world. It could be that. It could be 120 years exactly. I don't know. I'm just saying these are possibilities. And I think these are the more likely possibilities than actually just saying, well, here God limits lifespans of humans to 120 years. If it is about human lifespans from this point on, then perhaps the literary point could be that humans would just generally live long enough to see their children to 3 or 4 generations. Again, if it's about a round number about generations, then you can say, okay, it's about lifespans. I'll let you live long enough to see your grandkids, maybe your great-grandkids. And then after that, no more. But I don't think that's as exact an interpretation or as good an interpretation